Okay, I am on just a little bit early to make sure that everything is working and that things are doing what they're supposed to. So if you see that I am here and you can hear me, go ahead and throw an AWC in the comments for me. Let's see. You can see that we've got Shannon here and Laura. And it looks like everything says I'm on and going. Let's see. All right, awesome. It looks like we're live. I'm getting AWCs from Shannon and Laura. So thank you so much, both of you. And if I look away from the camera, I am sorry. I am going back and forth between two different monitors to make sure this works. So it'll be good. We'll make it happen. All right, I'm gonna give it just another minute more for people to come in, but I'm super excited to see everyone. Hi, Desiree's here, Victoria's here. Awesome. So excited to see everyone. I'm so excited to talk about discovery writing. This is one of my favorite topics. This is one of those things that I'm passionate about. So I'm super excited that we've got other people here who are passionate about it too and excited to hear about it. All right, we'll give it just another couple seconds. Yes, Laura, absolutely. The joy of dual monitors, being able to have things going on different sides. Awesome. Okay. Well, it looks like my clock says top of the hour. So, hello and welcome. I am Elaine Canyon, sweetly writing happily ever after, one book at a time. And today we are live with the Authortube Writing Conference, and I am super excited to talk to everyone today about discovery writing and how you can succeed and thrive as a discovery writer without having to worry about an outline or feeling guilted into outlining, or like there's no way that you can be successful if you aren't outlining. So we're going to get started today. I've got a little slideshow presentation here, and we're going to walk through this. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I haven't seen him in the chat, but Andy with Easy Graphics is my chat moderator. So if something starts to go wrong, he is your first line of help to get you anything that you need there. I'm going to try and watch the chat while I go through this. But if I get mixed up, he's the one to tag and get a hold of. And then if you have any questions throughout the presentation, do me a favor and throw a Q at the beginning of your question so that I can get back to it more quickly. And then I want to also make sure that I mention that the Authortube Writing Conference this year is brought to you by Fictionary, which I absolutely love. Fictionary is a story editing software for writers. I'm a huge fan of their process, and I actually recently was able to get into their, what is the word I'm looking for? Their annual subscription, and it is fantastic, especially for discovery writers. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation and why I love it so much. I didn't know Fictionary was the sponsor of this conference until after I'd already written this whole presentation and put the slides and everything together. So I'm really excited that they are. All right, so let's get started. So a little bit about me, why you care that I'm the one talking to you. So I've been writing since 2016. I hit my 1 million words in 2022, and I have written 7 novels, 14 novellas, and more than 100 short stories. Many of them are all unpublished, but I wrote them all without an outline. The only time I've ever tried to write an outline for a story, it failed miserably, and it sits in what I call my story graveyard. In all of this, I've had to face that short reality that there aren't a lot of resources for discovery writers, especially when you get into genre fiction. I found that genre fiction, a lot of what happens is not telling you that discovery writing is something that you can be successful in. A lot of genre fiction authors who come out, and especially publishers who come out to give writing craft advice, they don't give you a lot of options when you're the discovery writer. And they also tend to guilt trip you a little bit. I got really aggravated because the number one piece of advice that I found as a young author was to force myself to outline. Often with that hanging threat that I couldn't be a successful author unless I learned how to outline my stories. But I am a very stubborn person. And naturally, that meant that I went out to deliberately prove them wrong. And not only did I want to become a successful writer and author, but I wanted to do it without ever having to create a story outline before I started writing my stories. And that's when I started keeping track of everything that was helping me as a discovery writer, whether I was finding it because I discovered it on my own, or I was lucky enough to run into another discovery writer that said, hey, this really works for me. So today we're going to talk about how I can help you with these tools that I've learned thrive as a discovery writer. And everything that I've brought together over the last 7 years. Now, I warn you, this is going to be a little bit of a fire hydrant, but don't worry, because all of these topics are things I either have already created videos for on my channel and have gone more in depth with them, or they're things that are in the works and those videos will be coming. So if you get to the end of this and you feel overwhelmed, don't worry, there's going to be more there for you. So I want to make sure that we are all on the same page of what is a discovery writer. Simply stated, a discovery writer is someone who writes a story without an outline beforehand. This is often called by other names. The most unfortunate of all is pantster. That's not one that I will be using in this presentation or really ever. And that's because I spent lots and lots of years consuming and reading British media, and pantster has some really terrible connotations when you take it from that side of the world. So I won't be using that term here. I'll be using the term discovery writer. Discovery writers are going to fall on a spectrum. And sometimes that spectrum includes knowing a lot of the plot points before they start putting words to a screen or a piece of paper. And other times it might include knowing the ending. And sometimes it might include having the character arc kind of figured out for the POV character or their character goal figured out. And other times it means that they don't know anything at all. That spectrum is massive in discovery writers. But regardless of where they fall, a discovery writer relies heavily on just writing the story to get from the start to the end. They don't have a very detailed outline that tells them what's happening in the plot. So thriving. Why did I choose the word thrive? Partially because it's a really good marketing word, but it's not the actual reason that I went with the word thrive for thrive as a discovery writer. I chose it because the definition of thrive perfectly outlines what we're going to talk about today. The Oxford Dictionary defines thrive as a verb meaning to grow, develop well, or vigorously, to prosper, and to flourish. So we're going to take those three things that thrive encompasses: growth, prosper, and flourish. And we're going to talk about how you as a discovery writer can thrive. When it comes to growth, I'm going to give you tools to improve writing. And when it comes to prospering, we're going to talk about ways that we can overcome writer's block and finish drafts, because that is one of the main things that the writing world does not give you answers on how to handle. When you get stuck, an outliner will tell you to just go look at your outline. But we're discovery writers, so we need different tools. And then we're going to talk about flourishing. We're going to talk about what it means to edit a finished draft and bringing that draft to the next level so that we have confidence in the stories that we're bringing out, that they're polished and finished manuscripts. So first we're going to talk about growth, and I've got 3 points that we're going to hit with growth. We're going to talk about structure, boundaries, and breadcrumbs. Now don't run away, because I know 2 of those words feel sort of blasphemous to a lot of discovery writers, but I promise you that we're going to do it in a way that still is true to discovery writing. So structure. like I said, don't panic. Discovery writers need structure. And when I say we need structure, I'm not talking about holding ourselves to a structure in the drafting process. When we're drafting, we want to let the story take us from the beginning to the end, or from the middle to the end if you're writing out of order. The story and your brain have control when you're drafting, and you don't worry about outside forces so much. But when we aren't writing, or when we're taking a break to do something else in the morning and we're going to write in the afternoon, one of those things we want to be doing is studying writing structure and the different forms that are out there. And there's a reason for this. As a discovery writer, what's really going on is your subconscious is telling you a story. You're discovering it as you go. But we can help our subconscious by giving it a lot of the information that we have for different ways that those stories can come out. Now, I don't want you influencing your story with those structures that you're studying as you write them. Like I said before, your brain is going to tell you the story and you just let it go. But if you have that information in your brain of how story structure works and what sort of beats need to happen in a story, and things like having your inciting incident closer to the beginning than rather the middle of your story, those sorts of things can influence how your brain tells you your story. And I've seen this happen in my own writing. The more I study structure, the more my subconscious tells me my stories in structure. And that knowledge has been hugely beneficial. So we're going to study structure, and that structure is going to help us have our stories come to us in an easier format that we can actually take those, and when we get to the editing side of things, it'll make it a lot easier if our brain has the tools it needs to give us stories in a more conventional way. Because sometimes as discovery writers, our brains will give us stories in incredibly unconventional ways that are not marketable. And I speak from experience. I have stories like this. But once you start studying structure, your brain starts picking up on, oh, there's a pattern I can follow as I'm telling you this story that's living inside of me, and I need to give it to you. All right, boundaries. Again, don't run away. I know this is blasphemous, but discovery writers need boundaries. And I'm not talking about an outline here. I'm not telling you to set rigid lines on your creativity and block off all of the ways that your story is going to flow from your mind to your fingers and then the keyboard or the pen. What I'm talking about is giving you ways to keep your brain focused on the story it's telling you. And sometimes in discovery writing, you won't know what those boundaries are at the beginning, and that's okay. Discovery writing is all about being flexible. So our boundaries, sometimes we know them at the beginning, and other times we won't know them until we're 10, 15, 20,000 words into the manuscript. But figuring out what our boundaries are will help us make sure that we get all the way through a story from start to finish. And boundaries can come in a lot of different varieties. So the biggest boundary, and the one that's the easiest to stay within, is genre. Genres have expectations that the readers come to them with. So I write in fantasy romance, and the most popular example of genre in romance is just that two people have to end up together at the end with either a happily ever after or a happily for now. And that's a really easy boundary to stay within. And it's one I use all the time because fantasy romance falls in that genre. Now, there's other boundaries that genre can set. So we all know not to expect that a sci-fi novel will have magic in it. We expect magic from fantasy novels. We expect technology in sci-fi novels. And if we want both, then we go read science fantasy. Those are things that can help you move forward in your story and stay under that umbrella and that boundary, that you end up with the same story at the end of your novel that you were telling at the beginning of your novel. Other kinds of genre boundaries that you can use are character archetypes or story archetypes. I caution you to use those boundaries loosely because I have found that they can suck the joy out of a story. When you're trying to force a character to fit a certain archetype and you get 30,000 words in and realize that that's not the story that your brain was telling you, that's not who this character is. And then you have to start over because you were trying so hard to make them be this thing, and all along they were something different. You can have other broad boundaries like word count, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation, but word count can help you with finishing stories. And then there's also things like tropes and subversion of tropes. I love tropes mostly because I'm a romance author, and tropes in the romance community are like the be all end all. They're the sacred word. We use them in marketing because romance readers love tropes so much. And so there's a lot that makes it really easy when you're a romance writer, but there are tropes in all the other genres too. For example, in horror, we know that the first person to walk into a haunted house is likely the first one to die. And in fantasy, we know not to get too attached to the wise old mentor because they likely won't be around to the end of the book. So these are also tropes that come out of other genres. And if you're looking for those tropes and you know that you want them in your story, they can help keep you moving forward and making sure that you're still playing within your lane. I have a video about this, and one of the things that I like to compare boundaries to is just picking what garden I'm playing in and what flowers do I get to use. So am I going to be playing in the rose bushes, or am I only playing with the daffodils? Or am I going to also include the daisies? Being able to choose where you're playing, you're building that sandbox and putting yourself inside the sandbox and saying, okay, I'm going to play only in the sandbox before I choose to go do something in a different sandbox. And that can help immensely with making sure, like I said before, that the story that you start writing ends up being the story you end up finishing. I've heard a lot of discovery writers complain, well, I started one story, but by the time I got to the end, it felt like a different book. And boundaries are a really good way to help make sure that that doesn't happen to you. So the last thing that we're going to talk about in growth is breadcrumbs. We all know the story of Hansel and Gretel. They left breadcrumbs to find their way home. And discovery writers also need to leave breadcrumbs while they're drafting. And we're going to leave better breadcrumbs than Hansel and Gretel because we don't want ours to be eaten up. So what breadcrumbs are we leaving as we go? And what we're going to do is we're going to keep track of the pesky little details that slip your mind when you're 50,000 words into a story and you have to reference something that happened at 10,000 words in the story. One of the things for me that I have to keep track of consistently is eye color of my characters. I do not know why, but I'm completely incapable of remembering what color eyes I gave my characters. And if I don't keep track of it, their eye color will change 3 different colors throughout the course of the story. Other things that are important to keep track of are your timeline. Making sure that you know how to spell your character names in places if you're writing in fantasy, and that you're just keeping track and making sure that you're autocorrect and is not trying to fix it for you. I write on my phone pretty consistently, and my phone hates my fantasy character names. And I have a character named Damien in a book, and he is Domino's, I think probably 20% through the book, that I have to go back and fix it because my phone just doesn't like that it's Damien. Other things is, how long did you say it was going to take to get from one place to another? How fast does mail move? How much does something cost? If you started referencing how much things cost, there are other little details that it's important to keep track of because it makes your editing process so much faster and easier. This is a little bit like getting yourself the basics of a story Bible as you're writing. So if you have a grand prize in your story and you made it $100,000, don't be surprised if you're not keeping track of that if 20,000 words later now it's $150,000, because what you're referencing from page 5 to page 155 can be really hard to keep track of. And so those little things, if we can keep them consistent through that first draft, then when we're editing, there's that much less that we have to go back and work with. Now, I caution you to do this outside of the draft. Have a separate document or a legal pad or a special notebook, anything away from the draft to keep those little details in, because when they're in the draft, I have found I lose them. When I first started doing this, I thought I could just put comments in my draft, in the manuscript draft, and that I could get to them that way. And then I got to the end of the story and I had lost those comments because there were so many of them in the draft. And it might be that you have a better method of doing it, and by all means make it work. But for me, that just did not happen. Dean Wesley Smith, who is famously the discovery writers of all discovery writers, he has a yellow legal pad for every single book he's ever written. And that's where he keeps track of all of those pesky details. All right, so now we're going to talk about prospering. And when we're talking about prospering, I'm talking about overcoming writer's block and finishing drafts. So outliners always have their outline to fall back on. And that doesn't apply to us as a discovery writers. So if an outliner gets stuck, they go back to their outline and they work on their outline to figure out, okay, why am I stuck and what needs to change, what needs to be fixed? And we don't have that option. So I've discovered in my discovery writing 4 tools that help me whenever writer's block comes up or whenever I'm stuck and I'm having a hard time finishing a draft. They're cycling, embracing the unknown, underwriting and overwriting, and then flash fiction and fan fiction. So first, we're going to talk about cycling. And I'm obviously not talking about bicycles. So cycling is often called loop editing or circle editing. And I first learned about it from Dean Wesley Smith's amazing book, Writing into the Dark. He is the discovery writer of all discovery writers, like I said, and that book is a quick read and I adore it, and we'll talk about it again later on, but it is linked in the description of this video. So what cycling is, it is where you pick a certain amount of words to go back and read through from your draft before continuing. This amount could be 400 words, it could be 1,000 words, it could be a whole chapter. Now, when you're using it as an editing process, which we'll come back and talk more about this a little bit later on, you go back to that point and you edit all the way through and do a full edit before you move forward. I have found that cycling is also a great tool for getting past writer's block. Whenever I have found myself stuck in a draft, I go back a chapter or 2 and I read through to where I am stuck. Every now and again, I have had to go all the way back to the beginning of the draft and read through to where I am. But usually, just the last chapter or 2 that I've written will get me out of the writer's block and get me writing again. And this works because you're reminding your brain where you've already been. When we go back and we see what we've already discovered in the story to the point that we're stuck in it, it can reignite our imaginations and our minds, and it brings us back to the story that's still deep inside us and can push us through to the end. That story is always there, but sometimes we get stuck in the writing and we forget why we're excited about it. And often going back and reading what's already there and remembering how much fun it was to write those other parts, that will get you going again. Dean Wesley Smith, he compares this to getting a running start at the base of a big hill that he needs to run over. And that running start and the old kind of butt in the chair method can work miracles when we're stuck in a draft and not sure where the story is going to go next. So next we're going to talk about embracing the unknown. So a lot of the writing world has been shaped by outliners, and that's mostly because traditional publishers love outliners. It's really easy for them to start greenlighting novels when they already know exactly what the novel is going to be about. But what that means is that a lot of writing is taught from the lens of outliners. Outliners know what's going to happen beforehand, and occasionally their plans do get usurped. But an outliner has a map and they know where they're going. We are not outliners. We are discovery writers. There is no map. And so we have to embrace the unknown. We have to embrace that we're going to get to rivers that are so big, we have to figure out how to cross them. And mountains so high, it's going to take days to climb over them. And miles of desert that we have to be brave enough to cross in order to find our way to the other side. Now, there are ways to make this journey easier. Cycling is a great option. Brandon Sanderson's rule of cool and is one that I really love. It's just picking your favorite thing. You look at everything that could happen and you look at all of your options, and whatever looks like it's going to be the most fun, that's the one you pick. Rolling dice and having a list of all of the things that could happen next and letting the dice determine what happens next in your story, or using story cards is another great option to embrace the unknown. I love the Cthulhu story decks, and I'll use those with a D20 dice and a list of everything that could happen. And between all of that, it gives me lots of options in how I can move forward in my story, even though I don't have a map telling me where I'm going. And one of the things that I'll caution with all of this, part of embracing the unknown is realizing that there is a such thing as quicksand, and it's very real. When you're exploring and cutting new paths, you're likely to run into places where you have to stop and pull yourself out and try again. And we want to be careful that we don't end up in the trap of continually editing a draft before it's finished. But we also have to be very aware that it's likely that we'll pick one of these options and start going head first and fall and end up in quicksand and have to pull ourselves out and try going in a different direction. So when we can be willing to face our drafts knowing that backtracking might happen and we might have to try a different path, that is empowering and freeing as a discovery writer, because now you're not worried about, well, wait, I've already written 2,000 words here. I don't want to cut that 2,000 words because then it sets me back. And that mind shift into, well, that 2,000 words told me where not to go. I can shift now and find the right 2,000 words that is where the story needs to go. That makes all the difference in the way that you think about your draft. So we want to, as discovery writers, stop thinking and holding ourselves to the same methods and mindsets that outliners use. We have to embrace the unknown and jump in with both feet, even when we don't know where we're going or how long it's going to take us to get there. So next is knowing whether or not you're an underwriter or if you're an overwriter. An underwriter is what I am, and that is somebody who naturally writes less than the story needs in their first draft. For me and a lot of other authors who are underwriters, you'll see this manifested as what's called white room syndrome or talking heads. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's characters operating in white rooms because the author has left out a lot of the descriptions and a lot of the setting. And it's simply the characters talking to each other on the page and getting through a plot, but there's not a lot else going on. Overwriters work in a different way. They tend to include more than their story needs in their first draft. This can manifest itself in things like describing world building that doesn't help or move the plot forward, inner monologues that end up becoming character exploration, or backstory that doesn't need to be there for the reader. And all of these are good things. I'm not saying that either an underwriter or an overwriter is bad, but what I am saying is that knowing where you fall on this continuum can help you finish drafts. So one of the tools that helps both underwriters and overwriters, and I talked about a little bit in boundaries, is word count. If you're an underwriter, setting a minimum word count for yourself before you can move on to the next chapter is hugely helpful. And for an overwriter, setting a word count maximum for your chapters is a really effective way for a lot of discovery writers to keep track of how they're doing in the story and are they filling the spaces that need filled, or in an overwriter situation, are they keeping out what isn't relevant to the plot so that way the story continues to move forward. Cycling helps both underwriters and overwriters too, to be able to go back and just check to make sure that they're still moving the story forward and that they're not leaving out important details for underwriters, like the sensory of their world or the interiority details for their character, or for overwriters, that they're not getting bogged down in world building or character exploration. So knowing where you fall on both of the, or on this continuum, whether you're more of an underwriter or more of an overwriter, having that information about yourself helps you to become more aware as you're writing a story as to what you need in order to finish the draft. So now we're going to talk a little bit about flash fiction and fan fiction. There are two reasons that I have commonly seen with discovery writers, myself included, for struggling to finish drafts. The first is how overwhelming 40,000 to 100,000 words can look when you've never written anything bigger than an essay for your English class. When I learned the first time that a novel was supposed to be 40,000 words, I decided that that was impossible. And then I learned about flash fiction. Now, flash fiction is generally defined as any story that's shorter than 1,000 words. And with flash fiction, you can also have specific word count stories, like 6-word stories. Ernest Hemingway is famously credited with his 6-word story, For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. I warn you now that if you're not one for sad things, don't go Google 6-word stories. This is one of the tamer examples. They get very, very depressing very, very quickly. But that's a good example of being able to tell an entire story. There's a whole story right there. There's somebody selling baby shoes that were never worn, that were meant to be worn. There's also 100-word stories. If you follow me on Instagram, you know that I like to post 100-word stories and vignettes as one of the things that I put up there. And flash fiction is a great way to get used to writing a beginning and a middle and an end to a story without feeling like you need to create an entire novel around it. So you're giving yourself permission to write something short. And when you write something short, I promise you that if you continue writing, your brain will start gaining momentum. So I started in flash fiction. I started with stories that were less than 500 words. And as I kept writing consistently, I gained that momentum and they gradually began moving up in word count. And now I consistently write novels where the first draft is 80,000 words or more. And I'm an underwriter. That goes up because I always have to go back and put more things in because there's never enough setting in my first drafts. The second reason that I see discovery writers struggle to finish drafts is that it often feels super overwhelming to create your own characters and a world to put them in, even if it's our own contemporary world. And it helps none of us that every outliner that you talk to and say, I'm struggling with this, immediately hands you a character sheet to fill out that's more in depth than a D&D character profile. And then they hand you a list of world building elements as long as my TBR list. That doesn't help anyone. So what helped me come away from all of this overwhelm is this amazing thing that tackles both of these problems, and it's called fan fiction. Now, if you don't know what fan fiction is, it's using another creator's characters or world or both to write a story. For those of you who have the unfortunate misinformation that fan fiction is nothing but explicit material, allow me to be the one to tell you that is absolutely not the case. Saying that fan fiction is only explicit material is like saying that erotica is the only thing you can find in original fiction. So it's just not accurate. But fan fiction allows you to focus on how to tell a story. You pick an author's work that you know really well. For me, it was the Harry Potter universe. And you take the pressure off of yourself entirely to develop completely new stories by playing with the characters or the world that you're comfortable with. You don't have to figure everything out from the start this way. I started with day in the life moments for characters that I love. And it was a great place to start because it got me writing and thinking about things like character motivation and how the world affected the characters. And these little vignettes that I was writing quickly grew into stories with a beginning and a middle and an end. And they grew from less than 1,000 word stories to 90,000 words. I have fan fiction novels that are 90,000 words long, where all I was doing was taking the characters out of the Harry Potter world and putting them in my own fantasy worlds and creating everything for them and changing backstory. And that was about the time I realized that maybe I had figured this out and maybe I could take a crack at an original novel. And I did, and it started working, and I shifted entirely to writing original fiction. So now I want to talk about how we're going to help you flourish as a discovery writer. And we're going to take our drafts to the next level. And what I mean by that is when we finish our first draft, we can then polish it and make it a marketable masterpiece. Now we're going to do this by creating maps, and we're going to dive into what it actually means to edit as a discovery writer. So a lot of people actually call this reverse outlining and outlining as you go. I like to call it mapping. So what we're doing is we're mapping out our story after the fact or as we're writing it. If you're going to map out your story after you finish the draft, this is the process I use. What you'll do is you'll let your story sit for a while. I suggest at least a couple of weeks. In my case, I will do 3 months. I try to let it sit for 3 months. And then I go back through and I map all those structural story pieces that I've been studying. And I'll map character arcs that I've been studying because I've been studying how character arcs work. And so now I can go back and look at my characters and say, oh, I see the arc that they're on. And I do a lot of the things that outliners love to do before they start writing after I finish the draft. And this is where you go through that ridiculously long list of world building, or you can fill out those really detailed character sheets because now you know who your character is. And now you know what the world actually encompasses because you've already written that first draft. And so if you like those things, if that character sheet looks really cool to you and you want to fill it out for your character, this is when you do it. Or if you know an outliner who has a really great world building schematic, this is the time to take their schematic and apply it to you now because your draft is done. Now, if you aren't like me and you don't have a problem with stopping in the middle of drafting, then you can get a head start on mapping. I have a really hard time stopping in the middle of the drafting process. And so I will do all of this after the fact. But if you aren't, then this is where cycling becomes really useful because after every chapter, you can go back and map your story. You can map out what happened in the plot. You can map where your characters are and how does it compare to where they were in the last chapter and what growth are they going through. All the things that you could map out at the end, like I do in my drafts, you can map at the end of every chapter or at the end of any section of words that you choose. This is actually how Dean Wesley Smith does every book that he writes. He writes single draft books. He does not send his books to a structural editor. He structurally edits in his cycling and then gets a proofreader at the end of the draft and publishes his books. And he is a very successful author and does a very great job. And there's nothing about his books that you would really be able to tell. I've read a couple of them. And it's fascinating how well he does this, and something that I kind of hope to aspire to someday. Then you're also going to use your favorite structures that you've studied as a template for your map. So if you want more information on what to put into this, this is where I'm going to send you to Fictionary. Like I said before, I didn't know that they would be a sponsor for this conference until after I'd already written the presentation and put the slides together. I don't get any benefit for mentioning them. They are just my favorite editing tool. And there will be a video coming out very soon about how to DIY Fictionary software for yourself on paper and do scene by scene editing. But to give you a hint of what's going on, what Fictionary has you do is they will have you go through and map your story with them. And we're going to talk about that here in editing as a discovery writer. So one of the main things that an outliner will say, and it is the second most annoying thing that they'll say, only to when we're told that we can't be successful if we don't write an outline, is that discovery writers have to edit more. And it's annoying because none of them then go on to tell you what it means to edit as a discovery writer. So let's dig into what that looks like. Back at the beginning, I talked about learning story structure. And the first reason for this is to give your brain those tools that it needs so that you can have those stories come to you in a better format. But the second reason is here. When you know how stories should be structured, it allows you to come at editing your draft with confidence, because all you're doing now is taking your draft and aligning it to structure. I know discovery writers who do this constantly. This is how they write. And Christina Stanley, who is the CEO of Fictionary and its main creator, she is a discovery writer. She created Fictionary because as a discovery writer, she needed something to help her edit because she didn't have an outline at the beginning and she needed a way to push forward through the editing and find those main plot points and story structure and making sure that her story was in a good place for that. So Fictionary helps you pick out your inciting incident, your first major plot point. It's that point of no return, that point where Bilbo Baggins decides he's going on an adventure. And then it's going to help you find where your main character shifts from reactive to active. And then they go through and help you find your second major plot point, which is that all is lost moment, and then the climax. And all of this can be mapped out with your word count, and it shows you an arc or the curve that your story is going through and moving from beginning to end. So once you've got your story mapped out, then you can go through scene by scene and apply that arc to every single scene. And you can go as in-depth as you want to be here. But what I like to do is I like to find those main points for each scene. And then I apply Fictionary's 38 scene elements and I map all of that out. And when I do this, it shows me when a scene isn't working as hard as it could be, or when my characters need better motivation, or when my pacing has slowed down. I write in fantasy romance, so I actually use 39 elements because I add magic into every single scene and I look at how magic is working in there. But being able to take a step back and look at every single scene and how it's applying to that overall story arc and structure is hugely beneficial and helps so much with making sure that your story is moving forward and working for you as hard as it can be. So everything that I've shared so far is to help you thrive. I want these things to be things that help you grow, so we're improving our writing, prosper by overcoming writer's block and finishing our drafts, and flourishing by learning to edit our drafts into masterpieces. Now, like I said, it was a little bit of a fire hose. You can always come back to my YouTube channel. I post videos on Wednesday on discovery writing, as well as cover design and self-publishing on an almost nothing budget. I also have links in the description of this video to Dean Wesley Smith's Writing into the Dark. He also does a whole bunch of online workshops if you have the funds to put into that. And then I've linked his 20 books to 50K presentation from last year. It is free. It's up on YouTube. It's fantastic. I highly suggest you go and watch it if you're a discovery writer and you just want to be able to really learn more about his process. I love Dean Wesley Smith because he is at the far end of the spectrum of a discovery writer. And so it's easy to take what he does and adjust it to your own process. And then of course, fictionary.co. Now, yes, you can buy the software, but they have a Circle community, which is free. It's linked below in the description. Their blog articles and their YouTube channel are fantastic. I learn a ton from them. Also linked down below. And then Secrets to Editing Success is the book that Christina Stanley and Lucy Cook wrote together. And it is basically Fictionary in a book, and it's fantastic. I love the book. I highly suggest it. Like I said before, I didn't know Fictionary was going to be sponsoring this. I get nothing for saying any of this. Fictionary is just an amazing method. You don't have to use the software to use the method, and that video will come out later this year that I'm putting out about how to do that. But it taught me how to really dig in and edit, and it was fantastic, and I highly suggest it. And all of those are linked in the description of the video below. So the TLDR, because we've made it down to the end here, is that you can thrive as a discovery writer. You don't need an outline to create amazing books that are marketable and that you can sell, and you can be a successful author without ever forcing yourself to outline a story when that is not the way that you function. All right. There it is. There's the thank you. I had an extra slide in there. That's okay. But thank you so much. We are going to shift here if I can find the right button to click. And I'm going to come back on camera. Hey, it worked. Awesome. Okay, so if there are questions, I'm happy to start answering them. We've got just a few minutes here left. I'm going to start scrolling for cues a little bit. I love some of these comments. These are great, guys. There we go. All right. I am not seeing any questions, which is just fine. I'm so glad that y'all were here to enjoy this with us. Thank you so much, everyone. JK and Mariah. Let's see. Who else is here? Hey, Andy. Nice to see you. Dreaming True. Thank you so much. Margaret, thank you. Victoria, thank you. Laura and Shannon, thank you so much, y'all. I really appreciate you coming out. I hope that this was helpful. I hope that this gives you some tools and the ability to move forward as a discovery writer and to feel confident. I think that was the #1 thing as a discovery writer that I wanted, and I wish I could go back and give to myself, because part of the reason I went the route of fan fiction was when I first started looking at whether or not I could write a book. I was told that I had to write an outline, and I didn't feel confident or comfortable doing that. So I thought I was only going to ever be able to write fan fiction. So I am a huge proponent for making sure that discovery writers know that they don't need to do that, that they don't need to write an outline. Oh, hey, we have got a question. Let's see if I can make it come up on the screen. I hope I can. We're about to find out. Let's see. That's not the right thing. All right, I'm going to read it because it's not letting me do it. So Laura says, how do you make a character act consistently in a draft when you don't know who they are yet? That's the hardest part for me. Laura, that is a huge thing in discovery writing. Like, it's hard to make sure that they're acting consistently. And I'm going to be very honest with you. This comes back to embracing the unknown. So I have characters, all of my characters, they'll go the first 5,000 words or more where I'm not exactly positive who they are. And I will go back at the end and have to adjust those first 5,000 words so that they are consistent through the whole novel. It is part of getting to know a character. And I do know discovery writers who actually don't start writing the novel until they've written 4,000 to 6,000 words for that character. So they'll start in a place before the story ever really begins, and they'll just character explore. They'll do a day in the life of the character long before that ever happened, or the story ever happens. Let's see. I hope that helps. I know it's hard. It's hard to be like, I want a good fast answer. And in discovery writing, there are no fast answers. There just aren't. We've got another question. Victoria says, how do you break up chapter scenes when drafting and editing? That's a great question. So a scene, one of the ways that Fictionary talks about being able to break it apart and know when you've got the start of a scene and the end of the scene is, did you shift locations? That's one of the biggest notifications to you that a scene has ended, is you've moved locations. Another way that you can check to see if you've got your scene start and finished is you look for those things like, where's the inciting incident? When did the scene actually start? What is the middle of this scene? What is the climax of this scene? Once you've found the climax of the scene, there's a resolution that'll take place a little bit afterwards, and then that's usually where your scene ends. And so I'll send you back to Fictionary. Their blog has tons and tons and tons of resources, and they're all free. The only thing that you pay for in Fictionary is the software. Everything else they do, they give to you for free. And it's why I learned how to edit. It's because everything they had was free and I could just consume it all. And so if you go to Fictionary's blog, there's tons of articles about how to tell when your scene has started and ended, and finding inciting incidents and climaxes scene by scene, so that you get to see everything as far as how many scenes you have in a story. And it takes practice. The first time I went through and marked out a whole novel scene by scene by scene, I actually had a lot of scenes that I had split them in half. And they really were one scene, but as I was going through and trying to figure it out, I had ended up with two scenes where it should have just been one scene. And it's something you learn. It really is. The more you practice it, the easier it is. So the first novel I did the Fictionary method with, I did it all by hand. I've got it all in a binder, all of the notes and everything I took, because I wrote the whole thing out. And it was a huge learning experience. But yeah, I was trying to figure out like how to get the inciting incident and the middle and the climax of a scene. And it wasn't until I went and read the scene after it that I realized I had split that scene in half initially. And I needed to bring them back together, because that's where the climax was. The climax wasn't in what I had. It was in what I thought was the next scene. Okay, let's see. Awesome. Oh, hey, Kelly. Don't worry. Easy Graphics is right. You can absolutely watch the replay. I'm glad you came. Let's see. Were there any other questions? I think that's all of them. Absolutely. All right. Yeah. So don't forget, if there's no other questions, we'll wrap up. But don't forget that link down below in the description is the form for feedback that you can fill out. If you fill that out, you're entered in to win 42 different prizes and giveaway things. I am one of the, or I've donated one of the prizes. So if you win, my prize is a 1-hour book cover consultation. So my day job is graphic design. I also post videos on this channel about graphic design or cover design specifically. And you can, if you win that, you can either bring a cover you already have that you don't think it's working very well, and we'll go through it and talk about what could be changed and how you can change it and adjust it. Or if you're in the process of writing a story and you want to create your own cover for it, then in that 1-hour consultation, I'll go through with you about what should be on your cover, making sure that it fits the market, making sure that it fits everything else that goes into your how book covers sell books. And if you want to learn more about that, absolutely hop over to my channel. There's a whole playlist. It's called Your Cover Design Toolbox. And it gives you a whole bunch of information there on how to make sure that your cover is selling your book. And if it's not selling your book, why it's not selling your book, and how to understand that graphic design elements so that the cover ultimately looks good and looks professional. And then if you're not somebody who likes to create your own covers, those videos will give you the words and the vocabulary you need to be able to talk to your cover designer, so that if you work with them and they send you something and you look at it and you're like, something's not right, I don't know what's wrong, but something is wrong with this cover, these videos will give you words so that you can go back to your designer and say, I don't like the composition you chose. This layout isn't working for me. Or you can come back and say, I don't like the font style you've chosen. I don't think that this script font and this boldface typeface are working well together. And all of those words, if you have no idea what they mean, that's what the videos are for, because the videos are going to tell you what they mean so that you can talk to your cover designers and you can use the psychology of design to help you create that perfect book cover for your book. Oh, thanks. Easy Graphics is also dropping my Instagram handle in there. He is awesome. Andy is a fantastic moderator. Thank you so much. All right. Well, I think that that's everything. Let me make sure here that I haven't forgotten anything. I think we're good. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I am Elaine Canyon, sweetly writing happily ever after, one book at a time. This has been the Authortube Writing Conference 2023, brought to you by Fictionary, story editing and writing software. And I hope that you have a great time at the rest of this conference, and we will see you really soon.